Recently, I wrote a tic-tac-toe program in C++. With all the hype around ChatGPT, I thought I will challenge it to improve my code. It had some suggestions, but not all of them were solid. Let's have a look at the advice OpenAI's recent invention gave me. This is the code that I gave to OpenAI. Basically a tic-tac-toe program, and it has some game logic, some drawing logic, and all around it is around about 200 lines of code, so not too much, but also it's, I think, a fairly solid example. This was the first advice that ChatGPT gave me. Use consistent naming conventions for variables and functions. For example, some variables use snake case while others use camel case. It is better to stick to one convention throughout the code. While in general this does make sense, let's have a look at my code whether this is actually a problem. So here in the code, I usually use snake or snail case because I think it's just prettier somehow. But of course I need to call some library functions. And for instance, the library functions in this case are from the DALL-E framework, and those have a different, basically a different pattern. And here we see that they use camel case for their variables and their stuff to go into. So while in theory it is correct that I should do that throughout my code, sometimes it's just not possible, and in this case it's impossible to change it. Otherwise I need to also change my code to fit all of the framework. And if I'm using two frameworks, then basically it's not possible. So while in theory this advice is okay, in this code it's just not possible. But maybe the next advice is already better. Let's have a look at it. Avoid using magic numbers in the code. Instead, define constants or variables with descriptive names. For example, instead of using 3 directly in the loops, define a constant like const int board size equals 3. And this is some advice that you really should follow. If you look at my code here, there's a lot of instances where I have this magic number of 3. I iterate through the rows, I iterate through the columns, and this 3 is at many places in the code. And here it definitely does make sense to use a const variable, a static const variable, to indicate that this is definitely something that is part of the code. So it should not be a magic number, it should stay the intent. And if I put the board size here, it's much more visible to anybody else reading the code what this loop is doing. So already a solid 1-1. The next advice is separate the game logic from the user interface. The drawSelf function currently contains both the game logic and the drawing code. It is better to separate these concerns into different functions. While also in theory this is absolutely right, in my code it is by design. I'm using a DALL-E framework, and the IM stands for immediate mode rendering. This means that I try to be as stateless as possible to simplify the logic that I need to do. For instance, I use here a game over variable or the winner as part of my game state to influence how my game gets drawn. And this is something that is called immediate mode rendering, and this is really good to reduce the state duplication and to basically make your code much smaller and less complicated. It is very good for small projects, but it might be not so good for bigger or really big projects, because then you might run into some issues. But I am a big fan of it, and this is why I do it here. Also, this advice, especially if I'm using the DALL-E framework, is just not useful for me. But the next one is better. Add comments to explain the code. Some parts of the code are not immediately obvious, and adding comments can make it easier to understand. And this is something that I completely agree with. If I look at the code, there are basically no comments whatsoever inside. And while comments are a good thing, you should always try to put comments in a way that they state why you did something. Because what you did is already obvious from the code. But why you did it and what are the alternatives and why you chose that particular implementation, this is not something that a reader can get out of the code, and this is something that you definitely should document in comments to make understanding your code easier for others. A solid 2 versus 2. Let's see the next advice. Use const whenever possible to indicate that a variable or function argument is not meant to be modified. This is something that you definitely should do. While it doesn't affect performance of your code, it affects the readability, and again, a const is some intent. You basically can tell here for the cell width, for instance, that I never want to change it. And if I put a const here, I make this obvious from reading the code. And definitely good practice, and definitely something that you should do in your code. Make everything const that you can make const. Last but not least, use range-based loops instead of traditional for loops when iterating over containers. For example, instead of for, use for row in game state. And this is definitely something that you should also do. The raw loops are powerful because you can do anything with them, but they are also less expressive. You don't state also the intent of what you want to do. So for instance here, if I would iterate over all of the different columns, it's much more obvious to the reader what I intend to do here, and then it's also easier for him to understand the code. While all of the advice that ChatGPT gave me seemed somehow reasonable, I have to admit that it's not really tailored to the code that I gave it. It's basically some boilerplate advice that I can give in any code review and that I most of the time also give in code reviews, but it's really not tailored to the code. Some of the instances where basically it tried to tailor the answer to my code is where it actually failed doing so. So any advice that it gave me is somehow solid, but I'm still not fearing for my job at this point. So maybe in 2 months, maybe in 3 months, I hear this stuff is getting better and it's definitely exciting. So stay tuned what OpenAI will discover or release next, and definitely try to use it because you can learn a lot from it. You can learn a new language, you can ask for advice in the language that you're already using, but always take the advice that you get with a little bit grain of salt. That's all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the content, and as always, enjoy coding.